It had become a regular occurrence. Every weekend, the same dream, his mother, and the same unfamiliar woman standing beside her. This time, however, the message was clear. Your data is needed more in Seattle than in Europe. Your childhood home needs you. Ethan woke abruptly. 2:30 a.m. London. For several minutes, he sat quietly on the edge of the bed. Why Seattle? Why now?
And who was the woman standing beside his mother? The dreams had become impossible to ignore.
Ethan Walker was 35 years old and, by most definitions, had already won. The Wizard of AI, as technology world knew him. Governments, financial institutions, and multinational corporations relied on systems he had built. His companies operated across continents. His wealth was measured in numbers most people struggled to imagine. At dawn, he made a decision. A simple message went to the caretaker of his London penthouse. "I'll be away for some time. Please take care of everything until I return." Then he opened another conversation. The name on the screen was Margaret. For nearly 15 years, Margaret had managed a significant portion of Ethan's European assets, trusts, and legal affairs. Somewhere along the way, the professional relationship had quietly evolved into something closer to family. They were not related by blood, yet Ethan called her sis, and she called him bro. He typed, "Sis, I'll be away for a while. Please keep an eye on everything." The reply arrived almost immediately. "What happened?" Another message followed. "Are you all right, bro?" Ethan smiled. "I'm fine. Going to Seattle." The typing indicator appeared instantly, then stopped, then appeared again. Finally, her reply arrived. "Seattle? After all these years?" Ethan simply replied, "Yeah." Nearly a minute passed before her final message appeared. "All right, bro. I'll take care of everything here. You take care of yourself." Ethan stared at the message for a moment, then locked his phone. By evening, his luggage was packed. The following morning, he boarded a flight to Seattle. He left his London penthouse that had appeared in countless business publications, stepped away from the circles of billionaires, investors, and executives who dominated his professional life, and returned to Seattle, the city he had left 3 decades earlier when he was only 5 years old. There, in one of the most prestigious neighborhoods overlooking Lake Washington, he moved into a large but surprisingly understated estate that had once belonged to his late father. The property was elegant without being flashy, private without feeling isolated, and for reasons he could not fully explain, it felt more like home than anywhere he had lived during the previous 30 years. One person was very happy to see him here. She is Maggie, who was a house help for his mother, nanny of his childhood, and taking care of this property since then. As renovations began, there was one room that immediately became his highest priority. The contractors referred to it as a home office, but Ethan had something far more ambitious in mind. Within days, the space had been transformed into a sophisticated AI operations center, filled with custom servers, data visualization walls, advanced computing systems, sensor networks, and enough technology to power several startups. It became the nerve center of his life, the one place where he felt completely comfortable and completely in control. When truck after truck began arriving at Ethan's property, carrying servers, networking equipment, computing hardware, and highly specialized technology systems, rumors spread quickly among the residents. Most assumed another billionaire had moved into the neighborhood. Some believed he was developing a secret artificial intelligence project. Others were convinced he was building technology for a government agency. Every day brought new speculation, but none of the theories came close to the truth. There was one detail, however, that very few people paid attention to: his vehicle. Unlike the luxury sports cars favored by many of his neighbors, Ethan drove a heavily customized electric SUV equipped with oversized wheels, reinforced suspension systems, and technology that made it capable of handling severe weather, flooded roads, and difficult terrain with ease. The vehicle looked unusual compared to everything else parked in the neighborhood, but Ethan had never cared much about appearances. Practicality had always mattered more to him than status symbols, much like everything else in his life. For Ethan, data was not simply a profession. It was not merely a business, a hobby, or even a passion. Data was the lens through which he understood the world. Every pattern told a story. Every trend carried meaning. Every anomaly demanded investigation. Analyzing information gave him clarity, purpose, and a sense of control that few people could understand. He studied numbers the way other people watched movies or read novels. It had long ago evolved beyond a habit. It is an obsession. And although Ethan had no way of knowing it yet, that obsession was about to draw his attention toward the house directly across the street, where a woman named Olivia Carter was fighting a battle that would soon change both of their lives forever. Olivia Carter, 35, beautiful, blessed by 3 mothers, and worried. But why? Only a few couple of days had passed when his attention was drawn to the elegant property directly across the street. It was there that Olivia Carter lived, a 35-year-old technology entrepreneur whose name was becoming increasingly respected throughout Seattle's competitive startup ecosystem. She was intelligent, strikingly beautiful, and the founder and CEO of a rapidly growing artificial intelligence software company that had earned the admiration of investors and competitors alike. Like Ethan, she was unmarried, fiercely disciplined, and completely devoted to her work. In many ways, although neither of them knew it yet, they were reflections of one another. 2 people who had sacrificed almost everything in pursuit of ambition and success. Work was the center of both of their worlds. Perhaps that was precisely why neither of them had ever found time for something as unpredictable and inconvenient as love. The truth was that they rarely saw each other. Olivia hardly seemed to notice anyone around her. Every morning, almost like clockwork, she left her house shortly after 7, and every evening she returned long after dark. She moved through life with the focus of someone carrying responsibilities too important to be distracted by anything else. Yet, while Olivia never appeared to pay attention to her neighbors, Ethan found himself doing something he could not explain. He noticed her. At first, it was merely casual observation. Then, it became curiosity. Before long, he realized that on the days he did not catch a glimpse of her, a strange sense of restlessness followed him throughout the evening. The realization irritated him. Over the years, he had met countless successful women. Models, celebrities, executives, investors, and entrepreneurs had entered and exited his life. Some had openly pursued him. Others had made little effort to hide their interest. Yet he had remained completely indifferent to all of them. He had always been too focused, too occupied, too detached to care. So why was it different now? Why was he paying attention to a woman he had never even spoken to? The 2 of them had never exchanged a single word. Not one greeting, not one conversation, not even a casual introduction between neighbors. Yet something about the situation had begun to bother him, although he could not have explained exactly why. Whether it was curiosity, fascination, or something deeper, he could not tell. Around the same time, something else began happening. Ethan started having recurring dreams. In those dreams, he would see his late mother exactly as he remembered her, young, smiling, and full of warmth. Standing beside her was another woman whom he did not recognize. She appeared around the same age as his mother and seemed equally familiar, despite the fact that he had no memory of ever meeting her. Neither woman ever spoke. They simply stood together, looking at him. Sometimes there was hope in their eyes. Sometimes there was impatience. Sometimes it felt almost as if they were waiting for him to understand something that remained hidden just beyond his reach. Each time he woke up with the same unsettling feeling. Was there something his mother had wanted from him before she died? Some unfinished wish? Some promise? Some path she had hoped he would follow? The dreams left him unsettled and increasingly desperate for answers. Yet no matter how much he thought about them, nothing made sense. Looking back later, Ethan would often joke that whatever plan fate had for him seemed to enter accelerated mode around that time, because events began unfolding so quickly that he barely had time to process one development before another arrived. His curiosity eventually shifted toward Olivia. What kind of woman lived like this? Every morning, she left before most people had finished breakfast. Every night, she returned long after sunset. Yet even then, her workday did not seem to end. More than once, Ethan found himself awake at 2 a.m. and noticed the glow of her home window across the street. Through the glass, he could see her sitting alone in front of a laptop, still working while the rest of the neighborhood slept. The sight bothered him more than it should have. One night, driven by equal parts curiosity and concern, Ethan did what came most naturally to him. He started analyzing data. He pulled publicly available information about Olivia's company and began examining everything he could access. Quarterly earnings reports, investor disclosures, customer acquisition trends, employee retention metrics, market performance indicators, operational expenses, supply chain data, hiring patterns, and stock activity all flowed across the screens inside his operations center. Hours passed. The deeper he dug, the more troubled he became. Finally, sometime before dawn, he reached a conclusion that made him sit back in silence. If current trends continued, Olivia's company was heading towards serious trouble. The warning signs were everywhere once he saw them. Revenue growth was slowing. Customer acquisition costs were rising. Employee turnover had quietly increased. Investor confidence was becoming less stable. None of the individual issues appeared catastrophic on their own, but together they painted a dangerous picture. Within 3 quarters, perhaps sooner, the company could face a major crisis. And if that happened, the person who would suffer most would not be the investors or the board of directors. It would be Olivia. Ethan stared at the data for a long time. For reasons he could not explain, the thought genuinely upset him. That was when another realization struck him. Olivia already knew. Maybe not every detail, but she had clearly sensed that something was wrong. No CEO worked 18-hour days and stayed awake until 2 a.m. without knowing that trouble was approaching. She had probably been fighting the problem for months. And despite all her effort, there was a very real possibility that the entire company could collapse.
Slowly, Ethan closed his laptop. For the first time in years, he found himself worrying about someone who was essentially a stranger. Years earlier, organizations had paid him thousands of dollars per hour to diagnose exactly these kinds of problems. Governments and Fortune 500 companies had competed for access to his expertise. Yet this time, there was no contract, no consulting agreement, no financial incentive. There was only a woman living across the street whose future seemed to be hanging in the balance. That night, Ethan made a decision. He would help her. But he would do it without revealing who he really was. Within an hour, he had created the first resume of his life. It was carefully edited, intentionally understated, and stripped of anything that might reveal his true identity. After reviewing it one final time, he submitted an application for a strategic analyst position at Olivia's company.
The next morning, before 10 o'clock, his phone rang. He had been invited for an interview. As Ethan looked at the message on his screen, he realized that Olivia's leadership team had probably recognized the same warning signs he had found. They were searching for answers, searching for talent, searching for anything that might help them avoid the storm that was approaching. What he did not realize was that this single decision would not only change the future of Olivia's company, it would change the entire course of his own life. Leaning back slightly in her chair, Olivia Carter studied the man sitting across from her and said, "So, Ethan Walker." There was a brief pause before she closed her laptop and folded her hands on the desk. What followed was supposed to be a routine interview, but within minutes, it became something entirely different. Their conversation began with technology, artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, and data architecture. Yet, as the discussion continued, it naturally drifted toward the future of the company: long-term strategy, market positioning, customer retention, and competitive threats.
Nearly 40 minutes passed without either of them noticing. Throughout the conversation, Olivia found herself increasingly intrigued by the man across from her. He was obviously intelligent and highly capable, but there was something else she could not quite identify. Every answer seemed to come from someone who saw several moves ahead of everyone else in the room. More than once, she had the strange impression that he understood the company from the inside, despite the fact that this was supposedly his first day inside the building.
At the same time, something unexpected was happening within her. For months, she had been carrying a constant weight of uncertainty, a pressure that never seemed to leave her mind no matter how successful she appeared to everyone around her. The future of the company had become an increasingly blurry and frightening question, one that followed her home every night and greeted her again every morning. Yet as she listened to Ethan speak, that fog seemed to be lifting. The anxiety that had become a permanent companion was gradually giving way to something she had not felt in a very long time: hope. After allowing the conversation to flow naturally for a while, Olivia decided to test him. She presented what she described as a hypothetical business scenario, carefully outlining a series of challenges involving slowing growth, rising operational costs, changing customer behavior, and increasing pressure from investors. The situation sounded fictional, but in reality, it was nothing of the sort. It was the exact crisis that had been occupying her thoughts for months and keeping her awake long after midnight. When she had finished explaining the situation, she looked directly at him and asked, "If you were part of this company, what would be the very first thing you would do?" For several seconds, Ethan remained silent. The question did not surprise him. In fact, it was the very reason he had walked into this building. As he listened, he had recognized every detail hidden beneath her carefully constructed hypothetical example. This was not a theoretical exercise. This was her company. This was the problem she had been fighting. And despite the seriousness of the situation, he found himself quietly admiring the way she had framed the question. She was far sharper than most CEOs he had met. He wanted to compliment her. He wanted to tell her that he already knew exactly what she was talking about. But he couldn't. Not yet.
Revealing the full extent of his knowledge would immediately raise questions he wasn't prepared to answer, so instead, he chose his words carefully and began responding. As Ethan spoke, Olivia's expression gradually changed. At first, she listened with professional curiosity. Then came surprise, then concern, and finally, complete concentration.
The most remarkable part was not that he identified the obvious issues. Any competent executive could have done that. What stunned her was the way he connected seemingly unrelated signals that most of her management team had either overlooked or dismissed entirely. He pointed to patterns hidden beneath quarterly reports, subtle shifts in customer behavior, warning signs buried within hiring trends, and indicators that suggested deeper structural challenges than anyone had realized. One by one, Pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. By the time he finished speaking, the room had become completely silent. Olivia simply stared at him. She had spent months discussing these problems with consultants, investors, board members, and senior executives. Yet she had never seen anyone cut through the noise and identify the core issues with such clarity. It was as though he had walked directly through every layer of complexity and arrived at the truth waiting underneath. Several seconds passed before she finally spoke. "How do you know all of this?" Ethan smiled slightly. The answer was simple. "Data always tells the truth," he said calmly. "Most people just don't ask it the right questions." For a moment, Olivia simply looked at him. Then, despite the stress she had been carrying for months, a small smile finally appeared on her face. It was the first genuine smile she had shown during the entire interview. At that point, she fully expected him to make an aggressive compensation demand. Given everything he had demonstrated, it would have been perfectly reasonable. Most candidates with a fraction of his insight would have immediately started negotiating salary, bonuses, stock options, signing incentives, and executive-level benefits. Instead, she asked, "What are your salary expectations?" There was no hesitation in Ethan's response. A faint smile appeared on his face as he leaned back slightly in his chair. "I don't want to burden you with my expectations, especially if those expectations happen to be higher than what you're prepared to offer. I think it would be better if you decide what fits within your budget and what you believe my contribution is worth." For perhaps the first time that day, Olivia found herself genuinely speechless. She had interviewed countless professionals over the years. Some had demanded enormous compensation packages before discussing the role. Others had spent half the interview trying to increase their perceived value. Yet the man sitting across from her seemed completely indifferent to the subject. The response felt so unusual, so confident, and so completely free of ego that it left a lasting impression. What Olivia didn't realize was that the salary truly meant nothing to Ethan. He had not come to the company for money. He had come to save it. And somewhere along the way, without either of them realizing it, the interview had already become about far more than a job. Just then, a voice from the far end of the conference room interrupted the moment. "Olivia, may I ask Mr. Walker a few questions?" The speaker was Richard Reynolds, the company's chief financial officer, a man whose decades of experience had earned him a reputation for seeing things others missed. Olivia glanced toward him, but her answer came immediately. "Of course, yes." "Richard Reynolds, CFO." Ethan shook it firmly. "I can't remember ever meeting you before, but you seem familiar." For a moment, Richard simply looked at him. Then a faint smile appeared. Olivia looked from one man to the other. "Would somebody like to explain what that means?" "Not yet," Richard replied. He glanced briefly toward Olivia before looking back at Richard. Richard picked up the resume and glanced at it briefly. Then he looked at Ethan. "You are 35 and a month?" "Yes." Richard nodded, then turned toward Olivia. "And 6 days?" Olivia immediately understood he was referring to the information she had just reviewed. She glanced at the resume once more and nodded. "Yes." Richard leaned back in his chair. "Good." Richard said, "Now, I only need yes or no as answers. No explanations required unless you consider it should be." The requirement immediately caught Ethan's attention. Richard then looked directly at Ethan. "You're Eleanor Walker's son?" Ethan's expression changed slightly. "Yes." Richard's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "They sent you here?" For the first time during the interview, Ethan looked genuinely surprised. He sat silently for a moment, then closed his eyes briefly, as if searching for an answer hidden somewhere beyond logic. Finally, he replied softly, "Maybe." Olivia blinked. She had absolutely no idea what was happening. Richard, however, appeared completely serious. He asked another question. "Both of them?" Once again, Ethan closed his eyes for a few seconds. When he finally answered, his voice was quieter than before. "Maybe, and I think she looks upset." Richard immediately shook his head. "No," he said with unexpected certainty. "She could never be upset with you. It is just the wait has simply been too long." For a moment, Ethan stared at him as though he had just witnessed something impossible. No one had ever spoken to him like that. No one should have known enough to ask those questions. Across the room, Olivia looked from one man to the other, feeling completely lost. What kind of interview questions are these? And what kind of answers is Ethan giving? Yet, despite her confusion, she found herself strangely unable to interrupt. Richard remained silent for a few moments before turning toward Olivia. His eyes seemed slightly moist now. "Whatever is going to happen," he said quietly, "is going to happen very quickly. This 14-year-old company waiting for—" He paused. "And perhaps they've been waiting even longer." For a brief moment, genuine emotion crossed his face before he collected himself and stood. Olivia noticed the tears gathering in Richard's eyes. Immediately, a teasing smile appeared on her face. "Well, that's a first," she said. Before he could react, she reached over and gently wiped away a tear with her fingertips. "I've known you since I was a little girl, and I've never seen you cry." She shook her head playfully. "Seriously, what is going on? Why is my strong CFO getting emotional during an interview?" Despite the tears in his eyes, Richard couldn't help smiling. The smile only made the tears more obvious. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard laughed softly and lowered his head, still smiling. Then, as though suddenly remembering an entirely practical matter, he looked at Olivia and said, "Olivia, your driver wanted me to inform you that your vehicle won't be returning today. The service center closed because of the storm, and the roads are getting worse." Olivia sighed. The weather had been deteriorating all day. Seattle's skies had been unleashing relentless rain since early morning, and forecasts suggested it would continue through the evening. Richard then turned toward Ethan. "You can give her a ride home, can't you?" Ethan looked even more surprised than before. The request came so unexpectedly that he needed a moment to process it. Then he quickly nodded. "Yes, of course, I'd be happy to." "Excellent." Olivia opened her mouth, then stopped. Under normal circumstances, she would have refused immediately. She never accepted rides. From strangers? Not at all. Yet, for some reason, no objection came. The silence stretched for a second longer than it should have. Finally, she simply nodded. "Thank you." Only after the words left her mouth did she realize how unusual they were. Richard offered both of them a knowing smile that neither fully understood. "Excuse me." With that, he left the room. After Ethan departed, Olivia remained seated alone in her office for several minutes. The interview replayed itself repeatedly in her mind. She had met talented people before. She had hired brilliant people before. But this felt different. Ethan Walker possessed an unusual combination of intelligence, humility, intuition, and insight that was almost impossible to find. More importantly, he seemed capable of seeing problems before they became visible to everyone else. The company desperately needed someone like that, Perhaps, she thought, she needed someone like that too. Within minutes, Human Resources received authorization to proceed. An offer letter was generated immediately. Ethan Walker was officially appointed as Special Strategic Analyst. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself lingering nearby. He wanted to speak with Olivia again, although he could not honestly explain why. The interview was over. The job was secured. There was no practical reason to continue the conversation. Almost as if she sensed his unspoken thoughts, Olivia emerged from her office and looked directly at him. "There are a few more things I'd like to discuss," she said. Then she glanced toward the rain streaking across the glass walls of the building. "We can talk on the way. The streets are already starting to flood." A small smile appeared on her face. "Please, come with me." Outside, the storm showed no signs of stopping. Water! The storm showed no signs of stopping. Heavy rain hammered against the windows, and dark clouds had transformed the afternoon into something resembling early evening. Olivia closed her eyes briefly. She wasn't surprised. Seattle storms were usually predictable. This one felt different. She reopened her eyes only when Ethan spoke. "What about your employees?" She looked at him. "What about them?" "In weather like this," he said, "how are they getting home?" For a moment, Olivia simply stared at him. Most executives would have been concerned about schedules, meetings, or transportation for senior management. His first concern was the staff. Without hesitation, she entered to her office of head of administration, just in 3 meters away. The man hurried over immediately. "Yes, Olivia?" "I want a complete assessment of weather conditions," Olivia said. "Coordinate transportation. If necessary, authorize ride services. Approve hotel stays if roads become unsafe, and make sure every employee gets home safely. No exceptions." "Understood."
Ethan nodded approvingly. Then he smiled. "Shall we go? You head toward the entrance, and I'll bring the car around from the parking garage." Olivia shook her head. "No." Ethan looked surprised. "No?" She gestured toward the hallway. "We'll walk together." Then she smiled slightly. "I've spent years running between buildings without ever paying attention to what's around me. Let's change that today." The moment they are near the lift, her executive assistant arrived carrying her bag. A few minutes later, Olivia and Ethan stepped into the elevator together and began descending toward the underground parking levels, completely unaware that the drive home would become the beginning of something neither of them had expected, and something neither of them would ever be able to forget. After a few minutes, they reached the basement parking bay, and by that time both felt as they knew each other from long, not met in her cabin from few hours for interview. Standing beside Ethan's vehicle in the underground parking garage, Olivia immediately had the impression that it was unlike anything she had ever seen before. It was technically an SUV, but only in the loosest sense of the word. Every detail appeared purpose-built rather than designed for appearance. The wheels were noticeably larger than those on ordinary luxury vehicles. The ground clearance was unusually high, and the entire machine carried an unmistakable aura of practicality and strength. It looked less like a billionaire status symbol and more like something engineered for a specific mission. Ethan offered no explanation. He simply walked around to the passenger side, opened the door, and gestured politely for her to get in. Olivia slid into the seat and immediately realized that the unusual exterior concealed an interior unlike any vehicle she had experienced before. The seat seemed to adapt perfectly to her posture, providing a level of comfort that make most luxury cars feel ordinary by comparison. Everything around her felt solid, carefully engineered, and remarkably quiet. There was no excessive display of wealth, no flashy design choices intended to impress strangers. Instead,
Every element appeared designed to maximize comfort, safety, and efficiency. The moment Ethan started the vehicle, the dashboard came alive. Advanced displays illuminated the cabin with a soft glow, data panels appeared across multiple screens, and a sophisticated navigation system silently calculated routes in the background. Olivia found herself unexpectedly fascinated. The vehicle felt less like a car and more like a mobile command center. Sitting inside it created an unusual sensation of security, as though the outside world had suddenly become distant and irrelevant. Meanwhile, Seattle's roads were steadily descending into chaos. Rain continued to pour from the sky with relentless intensity, and traffic throughout the city had slowed to a crawl. Cars sat trapped in long lines, emergency alerts flashed on digital road signs, and water had begun collecting in several low-lying areas. Yet Ethan's vehicle moved forward with surprising confidence and stability, navigating conditions that seemed to challenge everyone else on the road. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Olivia broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan glanced toward her briefly before returning his attention to the road. "Of course." She hesitated for only a second. "Why have you never been married?" The question was so direct that Ethan found himself momentarily speechless. Most people who met him were far more interested in his companies, his investments, or his wealth than his personal life. Olivia, however, had skipped all of those topics and gone straight to the one question he rarely answered. For a few moments, he remained silent. Then a faint smile appeared on his face. "Probably for the same reason you haven't." Olivia's lips curved into a smile. "You mean work?" Ethan nodded. "I mean work." The answer made both of them laugh. It was a simple exchange, but somehow it changed the atmosphere inside the vehicle. The conversation that followed flowed naturally and effortlessly, from business to life, from success to responsibility, from ambition to sacrifice. As the miles passed beneath them, both began to recognize something they had never expected. They understood each other. Not superficially, not professionally, genuinely. For years, they had both been chasing goals that demanded almost everything they had to give. They had spent most of their youth building companies, solving problems, carrying responsibilities, and postponing personal happiness until some undefined future date. Relationships could wait. Family could wait. Love could wait. Everything could wait until later. The problem they were both beginning to realize was that later never seemed to arrive. Somewhere along the way, life had become an endless series of objectives and milestones, and before either of them noticed, years had disappeared. About 40 minutes later, the vehicle finally slowed and pulled to a stop in front of a large waterfront estate. By then, Olivia had become so absorbed in their conversation that she had almost forgotten why she had accepted the ride in the first place. She stepped out of the vehicle and was about to thank him when a sudden realization struck her. She froze. Her eyes widened. Then she slowly turned around. "Wait a second." Ethan looked at her. "What?" Without saying anything, Olivia pointed across the street. Directly opposite her own house stood another large estate, one she had passed hundreds of times, one she had never paid much attention to, one that suddenly looked very familiar. She looked back at Ethan. "Is that your house?" Ethan casually turned to look. Then he nodded. "Yes." For several seconds, Olivia simply stared at him. Then, without warning, she burst out laughing. "You mean to tell me we've been neighbors this whole time?" Ethan laughed too. "It certainly looks that way." The absurdity of the situation hit both of them at once. For weeks, perhaps months, they had been living directly across from one another, one of Seattle's most successful technology founders, one of the world's most successful AI entrepreneurs, separated by nothing more than a street, and neither of them had known. Their laughter slowly faded, but something had changed. Until that moment, they had simply been a CEO and a newly hired strategist. Now, they were neighbors. And perhaps something more than that. Perhaps, without either of them realizing it, the foundation of a friendship had already been laid during that stormy drive through Seattle. As they stood beneath the rain-covered portico, Ethan noticed that Olivia seemed distracted, as though she wanted to say something, but could not quite bring herself to do it. "You were about to tell me something, weren't you?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Yes, but..." The rest of the sentence never came. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan smiled. "If you ever feel like talking, call me. Or just come over. Anytime. Don't worry about the hour." There was a warmth in his voice that surprised even him. Olivia simply nodded. "Thank you." With that, Ethan crossed the street and guided his vehicle toward the covered entrance of his own estate, while Olivia walked through the front doors of her house. Neither of them knew it yet, but despite being back in their own homes, neither would accomplish much work that evening. For the first time in years, their thoughts were no longer occupied by reports, forecasts, investors, presentations, or market strategies. Instead, they kept returning to the same person, the one they had just spent 40 unexpected minutes getting to know in the middle of a Seattle storm. That night, after returning to their respective homes, both Ethan and Olivia attempted to resume their normal routines. Emails still needed answers, reports still needed reviewing, and decisions still waited to be made. Yet something strange had happened. For the first time in years, neither of them could maintain their focus. Every time Olivia opened a presentation, her thoughts drifted back to the conversation inside Ethan's vehicle. Every time Ethan looked at a data model, he found himself remembering Olivia's smile, her questions, and the way she seemed to understand parts of him that most people never noticed. Neither would have admitted it, but both were distracted by the same person. Olivia had arrived home unusually early that evening, yet instead of feeling relaxed, she felt restless. She considered calling Ethan, only to realize she didn't have his phone number. The discovery somehow disappointed her more than it should have. After pacing through her living room for several minutes, she finally made a decision that felt completely irrational and perfectly natural at the same time. She would simply go see him. Without giving herself enough time to reconsider, she grabbed her keys and phone and headed toward the front door. She paid almost no attention to what she was wearing. A comfortable pair of floral brown lounge pants, a fitted brown tank top, and a light shawl thrown over her shoulders seemed sufficient. Her long dark hair had been loosely gathered into a ponytail beneath a colorful silk scarf. It was hardly the appearance of a CEO preparing for an important meeting, but appearances seemed strangely unimportant at that moment. As she stepped outside and started walking across the street, she felt her heartbeat quicken unexpectedly. The distance was insignificant, only a matter of seconds, yet every step seemed charged with anticipation. It almost felt as though some invisible force was gently pulling her forward. Later, Olivia would often think about that short walk, because she crossed the street that night, and in many ways, she never truly crossed back. She had barely reached Ethan's front door when it opened before she could even press the doorbell. Standing there was an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair neatly tied back. She wore the calm, confident expression of someone who had spent decades caring for a household. "Good evening," she said warmly. "Please come in." Olivia paused. The woman smiled. Mr. Walker just went into his study. He'll probably be occupied for another half hour. Why don't you make yourself comfortable? I'll bring you some coffee." Her name, Olivia would soon learn, was Margaret Collins IV, though everyone simply called her Maggie. As Olivia entered the living room, her attention was immediately drawn toward a large framed photograph hanging prominently on the wall. She stopped. The image showed 3 young couples and 2 children. One couple was instantly recognizable: her parents. But something about the picture didn't make sense. The little girl in the photograph, who was clearly Olivia, wasn't sitting with her own parents. Instead, she was being held by another woman she didn't recognize. Even stranger, a little boy was sitting comfortably in her mother's lap. Olivia stared at the photograph. The second couple was familiar too: Richard Reynolds and his wife Susan. But who were the third couple? And why was she in their arms? At that moment, Maggie returned, carrying coffee. Following Olivia's gaze, she smiled softly. "I see you found the photograph." Olivia pointed toward the unfamiliar couple. "Who are they?" The older woman's expression immediately softened. "Those were my employers," she said gently. "Mr. and Mrs. Walker." Olivia blinked. "Ethan's parents?" Maggie nodded. Then she pointed toward the little girl in Mrs. Walker's arms. "That's you." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. The woman then pointed toward the little boy sitting comfortably in Olivia's mother's lap. "And that's Ethan." Silence filled the room. For several seconds, Olivia simply stared at the photograph. Maggie continued speaking, with the fond smile of someone remembering a much happier time. "Mrs. Walker adored you. She never wanted her future daughter-in-law out of sight. And your mother wasn't much different. She treated Ethan as though he already belonged to the family. I've worked here since those days. I remember everything." The words hit Olivia like a physical force. Future daughter-in-law. Family. The room suddenly felt smaller. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it. Almost instinctively, she reached for her phone. She called Susan. No answer. Then she immediately called Richard. This time the call was answered almost instantly. "Olivia?" Richard's voice sounded concerned. "What's wrong?" Olivia could barely form a complete sentence. "Please, put Susan on speaker." A few moments later, both voices were on the line. Taking a deep breath, Olivia explained the photograph. The moment she finished, Susan spoke. "Calm down, sweetheart. First, tell me where you are." Olivia looked around. "I'm across the street." There was immediate silence. Then Susan asked a very specific question. "Across the street? In the Walker house?" Only then did Olivia remember Ethan's full name. Ethan Walker. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think so." Susan sighed. "Oh my God." The reaction only made Olivia more anxious. Then Susan asked, "Richard told me Ethan showed up at your company today asking for a job? Is that true?" "Yes." "And you interviewed him personally?" "Yes." "And you hired him?" "Yes." Susan laughed. Actually laughed. Olivia frowned. "What? Did he ask for a salary package?" "No." "Stock options?" "No." "Signing bonus?" "No." "What did he say?" Olivia repeated Ethan's response about letting the company decide what his contribution was worth what was worth. The laughter on the other end became even stronger. Finally, Susan said, "Do you still think he needs a job?" Olivia looked genuinely confused. "Well, everyone needs income." Richard groaned loudly. Susan laughed again. "Oh, sweetheart, you really don't understand what's happening, do you?" Olivia's confusion deepened. "What do you mean?" Susan's voice softened. There is a difference between someone looking for a job and someone looking for the person they're meant to be with. The room became very quiet. Did you look into his eyes? Susan asked. Yes. And? He looks directly at people when he speaks. Susan nearly laughed again. That's not what I meant. That man wasn't looking at you because he wanted a position in your company. He was looking at you because he couldn't stop looking at you. Olivia felt heat rise into her cheeks.
Before she could respond, Richard's voice entered the conversation. Do you know who Ethan Walker really is? She hesitated. Not exactly. Richard sighed. Olivia, Ethan Walker controls companies throughout Europe, North America, and Asia. If he wanted to, he could buy 10 companies our size without even noticing the transaction. He didn't come here because he needed employment. The words left her speechless. Richard continued. When he arrived in Seattle, he had no idea who you were. He didn't know where you lived. Yet somehow he ended up directly across the street from you. Then he became interested in your company. Then he analyzed your business. Then he applied for a position he absolutely did not need. His voice softened. Does that sound like coincidence to you? Olivia couldn't answer. Because for the first time, it didn't.
Then Susan spoke again. There were 3 of us growing up. Your mother's, Victoria, Ethan's mother, Eleanor, and me. We were inseparable. Her voice carried years of memories. The day you and Ethan were born, in the same hospital, only hours apart, your mothers made a promise. They joked that one day their children would find each other. Everyone laughed at the time, but neither of them ever forgot it. Olivia felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting. Maybe Ethan doesn't know all of this, Susan continued. Maybe he doesn't even realize what drew him here. But if he's finally come back, then perhaps he's come back for the reason your mothers always hoped. There was a brief pause. Then Susan asked quietly, Where is Ethan right now? Olivia glanced toward the hallway. I think he's in his study. Susan's answer came immediately. Then go to him. What? Go to him. Susan smiled. Wherever he is, go find him. Olivia didn't knock. She simply turned the handle and stepped inside, and the moment she crossed the threshold, she felt as though she had entered an entirely different world. The study was unlike anything she had ever seen. Every wall seemed alive with screens, while massive displays stretched across multiple levels, each filled with flowing streams of data, market indicators, security feeds, predictive models, global network maps, and countless pieces of information moving in real time. The room felt less like a home office and more like the command center of a futuristic technology empire. At the center of it all sat Ethan, relaxed in a large chair, effortlessly managing dozens of systems at once. Olivia understood only a fraction of what she was looking at, yet somehow that didn't matter. Before she could say a single word, Ethan shifted slightly to one side, creating space beside him without even turning around. He didn't ask who had entered, didn't look surprised, and didn't question why she was there. It was almost as though he had known she would come.
Without hesitation, Olivia walked over and sat beside him. Then, before she could overthink what she was doing, she wrapped her arms around him and rested her head against his shoulder.
Only after doing it did she realize how impossible the situation should have felt. She was Olivia Carter, CEO, founder, a woman known for her discipline, self-control, and relentless professionalism. Yet somehow, all of that seemed irrelevant in this room. She couldn't understand what was happening to her. Why had she crossed the street? Why had she walked into his study? Why did she feel so comfortable sitting beside a man she had only met that day? Why wasn't she stopping herself? Questions filled her mind, but none of them mattered enough to make her move. Meanwhile, Ethan appeared completely absorbed in what he was doing. Multiple screens displayed what looked like an urgent operation involving financial systems somewhere across the world, and whatever he was working on clearly required his full attention. The moment Olivia rested her head against his shoulder, he spoke without looking away from the screens. "Don't move. Just stay right there." That was all he said, and yet the faint smile on his face made it sound strangely reassuring. Olivia closed her eyes. For several seconds, she couldn't find the words she wanted, but eventually she whispered, "I can't seem to control myself. I don't understand what's happening to me. I don't understand why being here feels so natural, but it feels like this is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Her voice grew even softer. "It feels like my mother and Eleanor somehow left you for me." Then she moved closer and rested her head on his chest. For the first time in years, the constant tension she carried seemed to be fading. Across the room, dozens of screens continued displaying information, yet Ethan's thoughts briefly drifted elsewhere. Suddenly, the dreams made sense. His mother, the unknown woman beside her, the feeling that they had been trying to guide him toward something, toward someone. For the first time, he thought he understood. Perhaps this had been the unfinished wish his mother had carried with her. Perhaps this was what she had been trying to show him all along. Yet instead of speaking, he simply returned his attention to the work in front of him, while beside him, Olivia felt her restless heart gradually becoming calm. Several minutes passed before Ethan suddenly muttered, "You idiot. Looks like you've fallen for her too." Olivia immediately lifted her head. "What?" Ethan laughed. "I'm talking to my AI assistant." "Your what?" "My AI assistant. Apparently, it's convinced that my brain wasn't functioning properly until you showed up." For the first time that evening, genuine amusement sparkled in Olivia's eyes. "What exactly did it say?" Ethan shook his head. "It claims productivity suddenly increased after you arrived." He paused dramatically. "Then it called you beautiful." Olivia laughed. "And that's why you're calling it an idiot?" "Exactly. Sounds pretty intelligent to me." Ethan groaned. Sometimes far too intelligent. Both of them laughed, and for the first time in years, that room contained more human smiles than data. A giant display suddenly changed. On the screen appeared the exact dream image Ethan had seen for years. Eleanor and Victoria stood together in a beautiful garden filled with white flowers and golden sunlight. Both women smiled warmly as they extended their hands toward Ethan and Olivia in a gesture of blessing. Ethan froze. "Mom." Beside him, Olivia stared at the screen, tears filling her eyes. "Mom." For several seconds, neither spoke. Looking at the smiling faces of Eleanor and Victoria, everything suddenly made sense. The dreams, the questions, the guilt, the confusion, all of it disappeared. The AI assistant quietly broke the silence. "Boss, it appears the blessings are with both of you." Olivia rested her head against Ethan's shoulder. Ethan gently placed his hand over hers. Together, they looked at the two smiling mothers and understood. After a while, Olivia simply sat there watching him. There were emotions moving through her that she couldn't properly explain. Finally, she pointed toward the chair. "I want to sit over there." Ethan smiled. "Go ahead." She immediately shook her head. "No." "No?" "I don't want to move myself." The innocent expression on her face made him laugh. "You'll have to carry me." Without hesitation, Ethan slid one arm behind her back and another beneath her knees before lifting her effortlessly into his arms. Olivia laughed softly as he carried her exactly where she wanted to be, or at least where she claimed she wanted to be. The moment he sat down again, she settled comfortably beside him, leaning naturally against him. One arm wrapped around him, her head rested against his shoulder, and then she simply relaxed. The peace on her face was remarkable. It looked as though years of exhaustion had finally found somewhere safe to rest. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Then Olivia whispered softly, "You know something?" "What?" "This is my place." Ethan looked down at her. She smiled through tears. "Our mothers reserved it for me a very long time ago, and I think I arrived at least 10 years late." A tear rolled down her cheek, followed by another. But they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of relief. "Sometimes I wonder why you didn't find me sooner, why I had to spend so many years alone. Do you know how many times I was exhausted? How many times I felt like I couldn't keep going? How many times I wished someone would simply tell me I wasn't carrying everything by myself?" Her fingers tightened around his shirt. "If I had met you 10 years ago, life wouldn't necessarily have been easier, but it wouldn't have been this lonely." She rested her head more deeply against him. "I don't know what our mothers planned. I don't know what promise they made, but I know one thing." Her voice broke. "I don't want to leave." She closed her eyes for a moment before continuing. "For the first time in my life, it feels like all the fighting is over. It feels like I finally come home." Ethan looked down at her quietly. "Are you okay?" Without moving, she answered softly, "Yeah, I think I finally will be." Neither of them moved for several minutes. Eventually, Olivia glanced toward the screens. "What were you doing before I interrupted?" Ethan sighed dramatically. "Something urgent." "What kind of urgent?" "You've become very curious." She smiled. "Obviously." "Fine. A major international bank was experiencing a sophisticated cyber attack. One of my automated systems got stuck, so I had to intervene personally." Olivia blinked. "Personally?" "Problem solved now. And your AI assistant? It'll manage everything from here." Then the AI added a single word. "Figure." Ethan immediately pointed toward the speaker. "Don't start. If you're commenting on Olivia, we're having a serious discussion." "I was referring to the financial figure, boss." Another display lit up. $15 billion. Olivia nearly choked. The AI continued. 5-year contract, fully prepaid. Ethan simply nodded. "Oh." Olivia stared at him. "Oh?" "Yes." "That's your reaction to $15 billion?" Ethan shrugged. Before he could answer, the AI answered for him. He does this all the time. Olivia sat silently. Her company, the company she had spent 14 years building, was worth roughly $10 billion, and she was currently sitting near a man who considered a $15 billion contract only mildly interesting. Suddenly, Richard's words from earlier made much more sense. Curious, she asked, "How many employees work at your company?" Before Ethan could answer, the AI immediately responded. 0. Olivia blinked. "What?" "He built me. Then he distributed different versions of me across global servers. I do all the work. By the way, boss, You are exceptionally fortunate. Several floating panels appeared. Beautiful, highly intelligent, remarkably successful, and apparently only interested in you. The AI paused dramatically. Statistically speaking, this is one of the rarest outcomes I have ever calculated. Another panel appeared. Congratulations, boss. Your greatest achievement may not be the company after all. Olivia tried not to laugh, while Ethan gave the AI an exasperated look. Then Olivia asked, "What exactly do you do?" The AI answered instantly. "He signs agreements and stares at you." Olivia laughed. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." A new panel appeared. Journey duration, 38 minutes, 28 seconds. Another followed. Boss was disappointed when the drive ended. Ethan immediately pointed at the hologram. "Don't start." The AI completely ignored him. Recommendation: continue driving. Olivia burst into laughter. Even Ethan couldn't help smiling. Then her laughter slowly faded as she turned toward him. There was vulnerability in her eyes now. Real vulnerability. "Why didn't you find me sooner?" The question came unexpectedly. "Why did you let me struggle by myself all these years? Do you know how many times I broke down? How many times I had to put myself back together?" Before she could continue, tears overwhelmed her, and she buried her face against his shoulder. Ethan wrapped an arm around her. "I didn't know." The answer was honest, but Olivia shook her head. "No, I refuse to accept that answer." Her voice was muffled against his chest. Ethan smiled slightly. "What answer would you accept?" Without hesitation, she replied, "I'm guilty. I'm sorry. Please forgive me." Ethan laughed softly. "As your employee?" She immediately looked up. "No!" Her eyes were shining. "As the gift Eleanor left for me." The room became silent. She held his gaze. "I lost my mother years ago." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I'm not losing you too." Her voice became almost a whisper. "Never." Then she smiled through her tears. Because for the first time in a very long time, she wrapped both arms around him. "I'm not alone anymore." At that exact moment, there was a gentle knock on the open door. Maggie stood there, smiling knowingly. "Dinner is ready." Neither Ethan nor Olivia moved immediately. Finally, Ethan looked up and said, "We'll be there in a minute, Maggie." The elderly caretaker smiled warmly. "Take your time." Then she quietly disappeared, leaving them exactly where they were. Ethan paused as he looked across the dining table. The spread looked more like a holiday celebration than an ordinary dinner. Family recipes, freshly baked breads, soups, desserts, and dozens of carefully prepared dishes filled the table. Smiling, he looked at Maggie. "Is there some special occasion today?" Maggie glanced at Ethan and Olivia before answering. "Nothing official, but tonight feels special." A warm smile crossed her face. For years, this house had people, activity, and responsibilities. Yet somehow it always felt a little empty. Tonight, it feels alive again. Olivia lowered her eyes while Ethan pretended not to notice. As dinner continued, Olivia told him about everything that had happened since morning. The photograph, her conversations with Susan and Richard, and the discoveries that had changed her entire evening. When she finished, Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "My mother told me pieces of a story when I was young. After she passed away, most of it disappeared with her. I always felt there was something important I was supposed to understand one day. His eyes met Olivia's. I just never imagined it would involve you. After dinner, Olivia quietly led him into the hallway and stopped before the large framed photograph, the same photograph that had started everything. Maggie joined them and smiled. Look carefully. This time, they noticed what they had missed before. Baby Ethan sat comfortably in Victoria's lap. Baby Olivia rested peacefully in Eleanor's arms. Both froze. Maggie pointed toward the photograph. Eleanor, Victoria, and Susan never thought of themselves as separate families. Long before either of you could remember anything, they had already made promises to each other. What kind of promises? Ethan asked. Maggie smiled. The kind made by people who expected their families to remain connected forever. The hallway fell silent. As Ethan looked at the photograph again, it no longer felt like an old family picture. It felt like the beginning of a story that had started long before either of them could remember. Olivia quietly slipped her hand into his. Neither spoke. Somehow both felt the same thing. The photograph wasn't showing them the past. It was preparing them for something still waiting ahead. Dinner had ended, but the real problem began only after they left the table. As Olivia wandered toward the large living room windows and glanced outside, she stopped completely. For several moments, she simply stood there, staring. Water rushed along the streets in fast-moving streams, and visibility had dropped so dramatically that even nearby houses appeared blurred behind sheets of rain. Slowly, Olivia shifted her gaze toward the street. Under normal circumstances, crossing it would have taken less than 20 seconds. Her own house stood directly opposite Ethan's estate, close enough that she could clearly see her balcony and the lights glowing through the windows. Yet tonight, that short distance felt impossibly far away. The road between the two properties looked less like a neighborhood street and more like a river caught in the middle of a storm. A sudden gust of wind slammed into the house, pushing one of the lightweight planters several feet across the portico outside. Instinctively, Olivia looked at Ethan. Ethan looked out at the storm, then at Olivia, then back at the storm again. Neither of them said a word. Neither needed to. Both understood exactly what the problem was. A part of Ethan wanted to tell her she wasn't leaving tonight. The weather was simply too dangerous. Yet another part of him wasn't sure he had any right to say that. They had known each other for less than a day. What authority did he have to ask her to stay? Olivia was facing an even stranger dilemma. The idea of walking across the street felt absurd. Every instinct told her not to go. Every time she imagined opening the front door and stepping into the storm, something inside her immediately resisted the thought. Yet another question followed just as quickly. Stay? How? On what basis? What exactly was she supposed to say? The room fell into an awkward silence.
Even Maggie had wandered toward the window and was studying the storm with obvious concern. After decades of life experience, she appeared just as uncertain as everyone else.
Finally, Olivia picked up her phone and called Richard Reynolds. The call was answered almost immediately. She explained everything: the storm, the flooded streets, the wind, the lightning, and the fact that her house was technically only across the street, but practically inaccessible under the current conditions. Silence followed. Several seconds passed before Richard finally spoke. "One moment, Olivia." There was some movement on the other end. "I'm putting you on speaker." A few moments later, another familiar voice appeared. Susan Reynolds. Olivia immediately switched the call to video and pointed the camera toward the windows, showing the storm outside. Rain hammered against the glass, while lightning flashed repeatedly in the distance. My house is right there, Olivia said, rotating the camera toward the property across the street. But honestly, I don't think getting there is possible tonight. Susan watched the screen carefully for several moments. Then she suddenly said, "Connect the call to the television." Olivia blinked. "What?" "The television. Bigger screen. Trust me." A few moments later, the video call appeared on the large television mounted in the living room. Susan's face filled the screen. She looked first at Olivia, then at Ethan, then around the room. And then her attention landed on Maggie. Everything else immediately seemed to disappear. Her eyes widened. "Margaret?" Maggie froze. For a second, she looked as though she had seen a ghost. Then she stepped closer to the screen. "Susan?" Now it was Susan's turn to look stunned. "You're still there?" Maggie laughed softly. For several moments, neither woman spoke. They simply stared at each other. Then recognition fully settled in. Susan pointed toward the screen. "You worked for Eleanor." Maggie nodded. "And you were her shadow." Both women started laughing. Olivia and Ethan exchanged confused glances. Susan shook her head with a smile. Those three were inseparable. Eleanor, Victoria, and me. Wherever one went, the other two weren't far behind. Maggie smiled warmly. "How could I ever forget? The three of you practically lived together." For the first time that evening, the tension in the room eased slightly as two people who hadn't seen each other in decades found themselves unexpectedly reunited through a television screen while a storm raged outside. And somehow, both Ethan and Olivia had the feeling that Susan's sudden excitement had very little to do with the weather and everything to do with the fact that she had just discovered exactly where Olivia was spending the night.
Some promises survive time. Some stories wait decades to be completed.
To be continued.